Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into the ancient heart of Appalachia, where mist-covered mountains hide secrets that predate modern memory. 10 campers ventured into these isolated hollows, seeking peace beneath the stars. What they found instead were encounters that defy explanation, voices calling from empty forests, figures that should not exist, and presences that have waited in the darkness for far too long. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are real experiences, documented accounts from those who survive to tell what lurks in the Appalachian wilderness after the sun goes down. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. I work as a wilderness guide in the Smoky Mountains, leading hiking tours for tourists who want to experience the raw beauty of Appalachia. I have spent the better part of my 28 years exploring these mountains, learning every trail, every ridge, every hidden waterfall that most people will never see. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and my grandfather used to take me camping in these woods before I could even tie my own boots. He taught me how to read the forest, how to respect it, and most importantly, how to listen to what it was trying to tell you. I thought I knew these mountains. I thought there was nothing in these woods that could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. Last October, I decided to take some time off and do a solo camping trip on Balsam Mountain. It is a place I had been to dozens of times before, a familiar stretch of wilderness where the balsam fir trees grow so thick that the air smells sweet and clean, even in autumn. The trail is not heavily trafficked, which is exactly what I wanted. After spending all summer dealing with crowds of tourists who could not tell a white oak from a red maple, I needed solitude. I needed to reconnect with the mountains on my own terms. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, my camera, and basic survival gear. I planned to stay 3 nights, hiking during the day and photographing the fall foliage, then spending my evenings by the fire reading and enjoying the silence. I arrived at the trailhead around noon on a Friday in late October. The weather was perfect, cool, and crisp, with a bright blue sky overhead. The leaves were at peak color, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows painting the mountainside. I hiked in about 6 miles to a spot I knew well, a small clearing beside a creek, where the water runs clear and cold over smooth river stones. I had camped there before and always found it peaceful. The clearing is surrounded by thick forest on all sides, with the creek providing a natural barrier on one edge. It felt safe, familiar, like coming home. I set up my tent in the late afternoon, positioning it so I would have a good view of the sunrise through the trees. I gathered firewood, filtered some water from the creek, and made myself a simple dinner as the sun began to set behind the ridgeline. Everything was exactly as it should be. I sat by the fire that first night, listening to the sounds of the forest settling in for darkness. Owls called to each other in the distance. The creek babbled over rocks. Wind whispered through the balsam trees. These were the sounds I had grown up with, sounds that brought me comfort. I fell asleep easily that night, lulled by the familiar symphony of the wilderness. Around 10 o'clock, I woke to a sound that did not belong. It was heavy footfalls moving through the underbrush, the kind of noise a large animal makes when it's not trying to be quiet. My first thought was bear. We have black bears all through these mountains, and they are generally more afraid of humans than we are of them. I lay still in my tent, listening. The footsteps circled my campsite slowly, methodically, staying just beyond the range of my fire, which had burned down to glowing embers. I could hear branches snapping under weight, leaves crunching. Whatever it was big. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap slightly, shining the beam out into the darkness. The footsteps stopped immediately. I swept the light across the tree line, but saw nothing except shadows and the glint of eyes that could have belonged to any number of nocturnal animals. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just a bear passing through. I secured my food bag higher in a tree, checked that everything was properly stored, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke at dawn and immediately went to inspect the perimeter of my camp. What I found made my blood run cold. Near the creek, pressed deep into the soft mud of the bank, were handprints. But these were not human handprints, and they were not bear prints either. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own hand, with long fingers that ended in what looked like claw marks. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night. I crouched down to examine them more closely, my heart pounding in my chest. The shape was almost human, with a clear palm and 5 distinct digits, but the proportions were all wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide. I took several photographs, making sure to include my own hand in the frame for scale. I followed the prints along the creek bed and found something even more disturbing. About 20 yards from my tent, there was a tree with deep gouges carved into the bark. The marks were fresh, the wood underneath still pale and raw. They started about 8 feet off the ground and dragged downward in 4 parallel lines, as if something with massive claws had raked them down the trunk. I stood next to the tree and reached up as high as I could. My fingertips barely reached the top of the highest mark. Whatever made those gouges had a reach far beyond any human, and far beyond any black bear I had ever encountered. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and hike out, but I am stubborn, and I am a scientist at heart. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I spent the day hiking the area, looking for more signs. I found tracks in several places, always the same oversized handprints following no clear path. I checked my wildlife guides, compared the prints to every known animal in the region. Nothing matched. Black bears have 5 toes and a distinct pad pattern. These prints had fingers. I thought about mountain lions, but they are incredibly rare in this part of North Carolina, and besides, their prints look nothing like what I was seeing. That afternoon, while I was fishing in the creek about a quarter mile from my camp, I caught a smell that made my stomach turn. It was the thick, rotten stench of decay, like meat left in the sun for days. I looked around trying to locate the source, and that is when I saw it across the creek, standing in the shadows beneath a stand of hemlocks. It was tall, far taller than any man, covered in dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps from its body. It stood upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging long at its sides. I could not make out its face clearly in the shadows, but I could see the shape of it, broad and heavy. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other across the water. My camera was hanging around my neck, and I slowly, carefully raised it to take a photograph. The moment my hand touched the camera, the thing moved. It did not run like a bear or a deer. It simply turned and vanished into the forest with a speed that seemed physically impossible for something that size. I stood there in the creek, water rushing around my boots, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera. I managed to snap a few shots in the direction it had gone, but when I reviewed them later, there was nothing but trees and shadows. Whatever I had seen moved faster than I could process. I scrambled back to my campsite, my heart hammering in my chest, and seriously considered packing up right then and leaving. But the sun was already starting to set, and I knew hiking out in the dark would be dangerous, especially with something that large moving through the woods. I decided to stay one more night, keep a big fire going, and leave at first light. That second night was the longest night of my life. I kept the fire roaring, feeding it constantly, using far more wood than I should have. I did not care. I needed the light. Needed the sense of security that fire provides, even if it was just an illusion. Around 8 o'clock, as full darkness settled over the mountains, I heard it again. The heavy footfalls circling my camp, but this time they were closer, more deliberate. Whatever it was not just passing through anymore. It was watching me. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, a weight of attention that pressed down on my shoulders like a physical thing. Then I heard the breathing, slow, deep, raspy breaths coming from just beyond my firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. For just a second, the beam caught something at the edge of the clearing. It was standing there, just outside the circle of light, towering over the underbrush. I saw the outline of its massive frame, the shape of broad shoulders, long arms. The light reflected off its eyes, 2 points of pale yellow that glowed in the darkness. Then it made a sound, a low, guttural vocalization that was neither growl nor roar, something that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I have heard every sound the Appalachian wilderness has to offer. I have heard mountain lions scream, bears huff and moan, owls shriek. This was none of those things. This was something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I backed toward my tent, keeping the flashlight trained on where I had seen it, but it was already gone. The breathing stopped. The footsteps faded. I stood there in the firelight, every muscle tensed, waiting for it to come back. An hour passed, then 2. Nothing. Just silence. Around 2 in the morning, I finally worked up the courage to retreat into my tent. I did not sleep. I lay there, with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, listening to every sound, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. Then, around 2:30, my tent started to shake. Something grabbed the rainfly and pulled, lifting one entire side of the tent off the ground. I could hear the fabric straining, the tent stakes pulling out of the earth one by one. I screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, and slashed at the tent wall with my knife, not caring if I hit anything, just needing to fight back. Whatever had hold of my tent let go immediately. I heard it crash through the underbrush, moving away from my camp at incredible speed. In the distance, dogs started barking, their voices carrying across the valley from some distant farmhouse miles away. The sound of those dogs was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, because it meant I was not alone out here, that there was civilization somewhere beyond these trees. I did not wait for morning. I tore down my tent in the dark, stuffed everything into my pack without bothering to organize it, and started hiking out by the light of my headlamp. I did not care about the dangers of night hiking. I did not care about twisting an ankle or getting lost. I just needed to get away from that place, away from whatever was hunting me in those woods. I hiked the 6 miles back to the trailhead in just under 2 hours, practically running the entire way, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure nothing was following me. When I finally reached my truck as the sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, I sat in the driver's seat and shook for 20 minutes before I could even get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the ranger station and filed a report. Told them everything, showed them the photographs of the handprints, described what I had seen. The ranger, an older man named Tom who I had known for years, listened carefully. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. He told me I was not the first person to report something like that on Balsam Mountain. Over the years, there had been dozens of reports from campers and hikers who described a large, upright creature covered in hair. Most people did not report it because they were afraid of being laughed at. The official position was that people were seeing black bears and misidentifying them due to poor lighting or fear. But Tom said, off the record, that he had seen tracks himself that did not match any known animal. He advised me not to camp alone in that section of the mountain anymore. I took his advice. I still work as a wilderness guide. I still take people into the backcountry, but I have never returned to that clearing beside the creek on Balsam Mountain, and I never will. I have heard the old stories, the legends that the locals tell about the Boojum, a creature that is part man and part beast, covered in shaggy gray hair, standing 8 feet tall. I always thought those were just folk tales, stories made up to scare tourists. I do not think that anymore. I kept the photographs I took that weekend. Most of them are useless, blurry shots of trees and shadows taken in panic. But there is one photograph that I look at sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep. It is a shot I took on that second afternoon, just before sunset, while I was setting up for some landscape photography. In the frame, you can see the clearing, the creek, the fall colors brilliant in the fading light. But there, in the tree line on the far left side of the image, partially obscured by a hemlock tree, there is a dark shape. It is tall, too tall to be a person, with broad shoulders and long arms. When I zoom in on it, I can almost make out the texture of hair, the suggestion of a face turned toward my camera. I swear on everything I hold sacred that shape was not there when I pressed the shutter. I was focused on the landscape, on capturing the light. I did not see it until I reviewed my photos days later. Whatever lives on Balsam Mountain, it is real. It is not a bear. It is not a myth. And it does not want to be found. I consider myself lucky that it let me leave that mountain alive. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of my tent being lifted off the ground, the feeling of being watched by something that should not exist. I sleep with my bedroom door locked now, even though I live in town, even though I am miles away from those mountains. Because part of me will always be back in that clearing, standing in the firelight, staring into the darkness at something I cannot explain. I still love the Appalachian Mountains. They are my home, my sanctuary, the place where I feel most alive. But I have learned to respect the fact that there are things in these ancient hills that we do not understand, things that have lived here far longer than we have, things that watch us from the shadows when we venture too deep into their territory. The mountains are not ours. We are just visitors, temporary guests in a wilderness that keeps its secrets close. To whatever it was that circled my camp on Balsam Mountain, to the thing that watched me from across the creek, to the creature that shook my tent in the dead of night, I hope our paths never cross again. You can keep your mountain. I will find my peace elsewhere. I'm a 31-year-old high school English teacher from Charlotte, and I have always loved the mountains. Growing up in the city, the wilderness felt like freedom to me, a place where I could disconnect from the constant noise and stress of everyday life. I started hiking in my 20s, gradually working my way up from day hikes to overnight backpacking trips. By the time this happened, I had logged hundreds of miles on trails across North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. I thought I had seen everything these mountains had to offer. I had weathered storms, encountered bears, navigated by compass when trails disappeared. I considered myself experienced, prepared, confident, but nothing in all those years of hiking could have prepared me for what happened in Linville Gorge. It was early June, right after school let out for the summer. 3 of my friends and I decided to celebrate the end of the academic year with a camping trip. We chose Linville Gorge Wilderness, often called the Grand Canyon of North Carolina. The gorge is a massive geological formation, with the Linville River cutting through layers of ancient rock, creating sheer cliffs and deep valleys covered in dense forest. It is one of the few remaining wilderness areas in the eastern United States, which means no marked trails, no facilities, just raw nature. We had all been there before on day hikes, but this would be our first time camping in the backcountry. Our group consisted of myself, my friend Marcus, who I had known since college, his girlfriend Dana, and my friend Rachel, who taught science at the same school where I worked. We were all fit, all experienced hikers, and we had planned the trip carefully. We studied topographic maps, plotted our route, packed appropriate gear, and filed our hiking plan with a friend back in Charlotte. We entered the wilderness area on a Saturday morning in perfect weather, blue skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. The plan was to hike 3 miles from the trailhead to a backcountry site we had identified on the map, a small clearing near a creek that would give us access to water. The hike in was beautiful. The gorge is spectacular in early summer, with rhododendron and mountain laurel in full bloom, creating tunnels of white and pink flowers along the trail. We reached our campsite around 2 in the afternoon and spent the rest of the day setting up camp, filtering water from the creek, and exploring the immediate area. We found a perfect spot for our tents in a small clearing surrounded by thick rhododendron thickets that created a natural barrier on 3 sides. The 4th side opened onto the creek, which babbled pleasantly over smooth stones. It felt safe, secluded, peaceful. That evening we cooked dinner over our camp stoves, talking and laughing as the sun set behind the gorge walls. We watched the sky turn from blue to orange to purple, the stars beginning to emerge one by one. Marcus built a small fire in the established fire ring, and we sat around it telling stories, enjoying the warmth and the simple pleasure of being away from civilization. By 11 o'clock, we were all tired from the hike and ready for sleep. We extinguished the fire carefully, hung our food bags in a tree to keep them away from bears, and retreated to our tents. Marcus and Dana shared one tent, while Rachel and I shared another. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike and lulled by the sound of the creek. I have no idea what time it was when the screaming started, but it felt like I had only been asleep for an hour or so. The sound jolted me awake so violently that I sat straight up in my sleeping bag, my heart already pounding. It was a woman's scream, raw and desperate, the kind of sound someone makes when they are in mortal terror. It echoed through the gorge, bouncing off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. The scream lasted for several seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. Rachel grabbed my arm in the darkness. I could feel her trembling. From the other tent, I heard Marcus unzipping the door. We all emerged from our tents at the same time, our headlamps cutting beams through the darkness. We stood there in the clearing, listening, waiting. Nothing. Just the sound of the creek and the normal night sounds of the forest. Marcus asked if everyone was okay, if we had all heard it. We had. Dana thought maybe it was an animal, a fox or a bobcat. They can make sounds that are surprisingly human when they are mating or fighting. But I had heard foxes before, and this was different. This was a human voice. I was certain of it. We were still standing there, debating what to do, when it came again. The scream split the night, closer this time, coming from somewhere up the gorge wall to our east. It was definitely a woman, and she sounded like she was being murdered. The scream rose and fell, becoming a sobbing wail that made my skin crawl. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and shouted into the darkness, asking if anyone was out there, if anyone needed help. His voice echoed off the rocks. The screaming stopped. We waited, straining our ears. Silence. Then it started again, but this time it was coming from a different direction. From the west, down near the creek, and then, impossibly, from the north, up on the ridge above us, and then from the south. The screams were all around us now, circling our camp, coming from multiple directions at once. It sounded like there were several women out there in the darkness, all screaming in terror and pain. The sounds overlapped and echoed, creating a horrifying symphony of human suffering that seemed to surround us completely. Rachel started crying. Dana was praying under her breath. Marcus kept sweeping his flashlight beam across the tree line, but the light only showed us the dense wall of rhododendron and the vertical rock faces rising above us. We could not see anything, but the screaming continued, sometimes fading to sobs, other times rising to shrieks that seemed to pierce straight through to my bones. I have never felt fear like that in my life. It was primal, overwhelming, the kind of fear that makes your legs weak and your hands shake. The screaming went on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 20 minutes. During that time, I noticed something else that made the situation even more disturbing. The forest had gone completely silent. There were no insects chirping, no night birds calling, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing except us and whatever was making those horrible sounds had fled the area. The only sounds were the screams and the creak, which suddenly seemed too loud, too insistent. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. We stood there in a tight group in the center of our clearing, our headlamps creating a small circle of light in the vast darkness. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, Marcus suggested we all get back in our tents and try to sleep, reasoning that whatever was out there had moved on. Rachel refused to go back in the tent. She said she would rather sit by the fire for the rest of the night. We all agreed that was probably the better idea. Marcus rebuilt the fire while Dana and I retrieved our sleeping bags from the tents. We sat there for the next several hours, keeping the fire blazing, jumping at every sound. We tried to rationalize what we had heard. Maybe it was a group of hikers playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of animal we were not familiar with. Maybe the acoustics of the gorge had distorted normal sounds into something that sounded human. But none of those explanations felt right. What we had heard was too clear, too human, too filled with genuine terror. Around 3 a.m, I decided I needed to use the bathroom. I had been putting it off because I did not want to leave the safety of the firelight, but I could not wait any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and walked about 20 yards from camp to a spot behind some bushes. I was finishing up when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was walking around our campsite, moving through the leaves and underbrush. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and listened. The footsteps continued for a moment, then stopped. Then I heard humming. A woman's voice, humming a melody that sounded old and mournful, like a hymn or a lullaby from another century. I crept forward slowly, trying to see who it was without giving away my position. I reached the edge of the bushes and peered out toward our campsite. The fire was still burning, and in its light, I could see my 3 friends sitting exactly where I had left them. All of them staring toward the far side of the clearing. Between 2 of our tents stood a figure in a white dress. Even from where I was hiding, I could see that something was wrong with the figure. It was too pale, almost luminescent in the firelight. The woman's hair was long and hung down her back, and it appeared to be wet, dripping water onto the ground even though it had not rained. The figure was humming, swaying slightly, as if to music only she could hear. Her back was to me, so I could not see her face. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there watching, but my body would not obey. I was paralyzed by a fear so complete that I could not even breathe properly. The humming continued for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Time seemed to stop. Then Marcus yelled. He shouted something I could not make out, and the figure in white stopped humming. Slowly, terribly slowly, she began to turn her head, rotating it in a way that seemed wrong, as if her neck could bend further than it should. I could see her profile beginning to come into view, and I realized with horror that I did not want to see her face. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to look at her face. Before she completed the turn, the figure vanished. She did not walk away or run. She simply disappeared like smoke dispersing in wind, there one moment and gone the next. I heard myself make a sound, a whimper of pure terror, and I ran back to the fire. My friends were all standing now, all of them pale and shaking. Rachel grabbed me and asked where I had been. I told her I had been behind the bushes, that I had seen the woman too. Marcus said he had seen her walk right through where one of our tents was standing, as if the tent was not even there. None of us went back in our tents that night. We sat by that fire, feeding it constantly, until the sky began to lighten with dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see by, we started packing up. Nobody spoke much. We were all too shaken, too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what we had experienced. We broke camp in record time and started hiking out. It was only after we reached the trailhead and were sitting in Marcus's car that someone finally said what we were all thinking. Dana pulled out her phone, which now had signal again, and started searching for information about Linville Gorge and ghosts. What she found made my blood run cold. There were legends, dozens of them, about a woman who haunts the gorge. The stories vary in the details, but they all agree on the basic facts. Sometime in the 1800s, a woman died in the gorge under tragic circumstances. Some accounts say she was murdered by her husband, and her body was thrown into the river. Others say she drowned while trying to cross the flooded river during a storm. Still others claim she went mad with grief after losing her child and threw herself from the cliffs. Whatever the true story, the legend says her spirit still wanders the gorge, screaming for help, searching for something she lost. Hikers have been reporting encounters with her for generations. Some hear screaming in the night. Others see a woman in white near the river. A few claim to have been touched or followed by something they could not see. The encounters are consistent enough that the locals have a name for her, though nobody seems to know what it is. They just call her the Woman in White, or the Screaming Woman of Linville Gorge. I researched further when I got home and found dozens of accounts on hiking forums and paranormal websites, people describing experiences almost identical to ours. The screaming from multiple directions, the complete silence of the forest, the figure in white appearing near campsites. Some of the accounts dated back decades. In a few cases, entire groups of experienced hikers had abandoned their trips and hiked out in the middle of the night, just like we did. I have never been back to Linville Gorge. My friends have not either. We have never really talked about what happened that night, except for one conversation about a week after the trip where we all agreed that we had not imagined it, that we had all seen and heard the same things. Rachel stopped camping altogether after that. Marcus and Dana still hike, but they avoid wilderness areas now, sticking to established campgrounds with other people around. I still camp, still hike, still love the mountains, but I'm more careful now about where I go and what stories those places carry. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, far older than human civilization in this part of the world. They have witnessed countless lives and deaths over thousands of years. Some places hold on to those memories, those tragedies, those lost souls. Linville Gorge is one of those places. The sound of that woman's scream still wakes me up sometimes in the middle of the night. I sit up in bed, heart racing, listening for it, before I remember that I'm in my apartment in Charlotte, miles away from that gorge, and I think about her, whoever she was, whatever happened to her that binds her spirit to that place. I think about the look on her face that I almost saw, the face that Marcus told me later was not a face at all, just a pale blank space where a face should be. To the woman in white who walks the Linville Gorge, I hope you find peace. I hope you find whatever it is you are searching for in those dark woods and along that river. And I hope you understand why I can never come back. Your gorge is beautiful, but it belongs to you now, and to whatever sorrow keeps you there. I will carry the memory of you with me always, but from a distance, from the safety of places where the dead rest quietly and the screaming stops at dawn. I have been a park ranger for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency for 12 years now. I'm 35 years old, and before this job I served 6 years in the Army, including 2 tours overseas. I mention that because people sometimes ask me if I scare easily, if I am the type to jump at shadows or imagine things that are not there. The answer is no. My job requires a steady head and clear judgment. I have dealt with injured hikers, aggressive wildlife, search and rescue operations, and the occasional criminal activity on public lands. I have seen people at their worst and nature at its most unforgiving. I thought I had a pretty good handle on what was possible and what was not. Then I responded to a call about an abandoned campsite near the Appalachian Trail, and everything I thought I knew about these mountains got turned upside down. It was mid-September, just as the leaves were starting to turn. A group of through hikers had reported finding a campsite that appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry. They said the tent was still standing, gear was scattered everywhere, and there were signs that whoever had been camping there left without packing up properly. That alone was not particularly unusual. Sometimes people get spooked by wildlife or bad weather and bug out quickly. But what made this report concerning was that the hikers said they found personal identification at the site. And when they tried to report it to local authorities, they discovered that the person whose ID they found had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. I hiked in with another ranger named Tom, who is about 10 years older than me and has worked these mountains his entire adult life. We took the report seriously, but figured we would probably find a reasonable explanation. Maybe the guy had gotten lost and wandered off looking for the trail. Maybe he had a medical emergency and someone had already evacuated him. Maybe he had just gotten fed up with camping and hitched a ride out, leaving his gear behind. It happens more often than you would think. The campsite was about 3 miles from the nearest road, in a fairly remote section of forest. When we arrived, I immediately felt like something was off. The tent was partially collapsed, with what looked like claw marks shredded across the rainfly. The fabric was torn in long, parallel gashes that cut right through the heavy-duty nylon. Tom and I examined the marks carefully. They did not match any animal I was familiar with. Bear claws leave distinctive marks with a different spacing and depth. These looked almost like someone had taken a rake with 4 long tines and dragged it down the tent with incredible force. Inside the tent, the scene was even more disturbing. 2 sleeping bags had been shredded, the synthetic fill pulled out and scattered across the tent floor. Personal belongings were strewn everywhere. Clothes, a first aid kit, toiletries, a camping stove. In the corner of the tent, we found a wallet containing a driver's license for David Marsh, 29 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. According to our database, David had been reported missing by his family on September 3rd. They said he had called them from a gas station in Tennessee 2 weeks prior, telling them he was going on a solo camping trip along the Appalachian Trail. That was the last time anyone had heard from him. What really got my attention, though, were the Polaroid photographs. They were scattered around the tent and in a circle around the fire pit, maybe 40 or 50 of them in total. Every single one had been taken at night using a flash. The photos showed the campsite from different angles and distances, all taken from outside the tent looking in. It was as if someone had spent multiple nights walking around the site, documenting it, photographing it from every possible vantage point. In several of the photos, you could see the tent with the entrance zipped shut, the glow of a lantern visible through the fabric. And in those photos, standing at the very edge of the frame, where the flash barely reached, there was a figure. The figure was tall and dark, mostly obscured by shadow and the surrounding trees. But you could make out the basic shape, upright, humanoid, with what might have been arms hanging at its sides. The figure appeared in at least a dozen different photos, always at the edge of the light, always watching the tent. In a few of the images, it was closer, and you could see more detail. Whatever it was not wearing clothes. The surface of its body seemed rough and dark, almost like bark or matted hair. Tom and I spread the photos out on the ground and arranged them by date. The Polaroids had date stamps printed on the bottom. They spanned 3 consecutive nights, from September 1st through September 3rd. The progression was disturbing. On the first night, the figure appeared in only 2 photos, both taken from a distance of maybe 50 feet. On the second night, it appeared in 6 photos, and it was closer, maybe 30 feet from the tent. On the third night, it was in nearly every photo, and in the last few images, it was standing just a few feet from the tent entrance. The final photo in the sequence showed the tent with the entrance unzipped from the inside, the zipper pulled down and the flaps hanging open. There was no figure visible in that photo, but there was something else that made my stomach drop. On the tent floor, just inside the entrance, there was a dark stain that looked an awful lot like blood. Tom called it in while I continued to search the area. I found the blood Tom had seen in the photo, dried now but still clearly visible on the tent floor and on the ground just outside the entrance. It was not a massive amount, maybe equivalent to what you would see from a bad cut or nosebleed, but it was enough to be concerning. I collected samples and photographed everything, following proper evidence protocols. We also found David's cell phone in the tent, dead but undamaged. His backpack was there too, along with most of his camping gear. The only things that seemed to be missing were his hiking boots and his knife. While I was documenting the scene, Tom called me over to the perimeter of the campsite. He had found something following a trail of disturbed earth and broken vegetation leading away from the camp into the deeper woods. We followed it for about 200 yards, moving carefully, both of us on high alert. The trail led to a small clearing where the ground had been recently excavated. Someone or something had dug a hole in the earth, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet deep. It looked exactly like a grave, but it was empty. The dirt that had been removed was piled nearby, and the hole itself showed signs of having been dug hastily with a shovel or similar tool. There were boot prints in the soft earth around the hole, human prints that matched the size and tread pattern we would expect from hiking boots. That was when I saw the tree. About 10 feet from the empty grave, carved into the bark of a large oak tree were 4 words gouged deep into the wood. "He followed me home." The carving was fresh, the wood underneath still light-colored in weeping sap. The letters were shaky and uneven, carved by someone in a state of panic or extreme distress. Tom and I stood there, looking at that message, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I have been in dangerous situations before. I have faced down aggressive bears, armed poachers, and situations where lives were at immediate risk. But standing in that clearing, looking at that empty grave and those 4 desperate words, I felt a type of fear I had never experienced before. It was the fear of something unknown, something that did not follow the rules I understood. As we stood there, I heard something moving through the woods. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from somewhere to our east. Tom heard it too. We both drew our sidearms and called out, identifying ourselves as park rangers and ordering whoever was out there to show themselves. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a moment of silence, they started again, but now they were moving parallel to our position, circling around us. We could not see anything through the dense undergrowth, but we could hear it moving, branches snapping under weight. Tom keyed his radio and called for backup, requesting additional rangers and local law enforcement. I kept my weapon trained on the direction of the sound, my finger on the trigger guard, ready but not wanting to shoot at something I could not identify. The footsteps continued for another 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. We waited. Nothing. 5 minutes of absolute silence. Finally, Tom decided we should get back to the main trail and wait for backup there, rather than standing in a clearing where we were exposed and vulnerable. We made our way back to the campsite and then out to the main trail, moving quickly but carefully, both of us checking over our shoulders constantly. We did not see anything or anyone, but the feeling of being watched never went away. It followed us all the way back to the trailhead. Law enforcement arrived within an hour. We led a team of officers back to the site, showed them everything we had found, and turned over the evidence we had collected. They treated it as a potential crime scene and began a full investigation. Over the next few days, search teams combed the area looking for David Marsh. They brought in cadaver dogs, helicopter support, and volunteers from local search and rescue organizations. They found nothing. No body, no additional evidence, no sign of where David might have gone. The photos were analyzed by both the state police and eventually the FBI, but they could not determine what the figure in the images was. Some investigators thought it might be another person playing a prank or stalking David. Others suggested it could be a trick of light and shadow, pareidolia making us see a human shape where there was none. But nobody could explain why someone would take dozens of photos of their own campsite from outside their tent over multiple nights, or why they would document what appeared to be someone or something stalking them without calling for help or leaving the area. The case remains open. David Marsh is still listed as missing, His family has offered a reward for any information, but nothing has come forward. The official position is that David likely got disoriented and died of exposure somewhere in the vast wilderness, and his body simply has not been found yet. It happens. The mountains are bigger than people realize, and there are places where a body could lie undiscovered for decades. But I do not think that is what happened. I think about those photos, about the progression of that figure getting closer to the tent night after night. I think about the empty grave and those 4 words carved into the tree. I think about the footsteps Tom and I heard circling us in the woods. And I think about something Tom said on the hike back out that day. He told me that these mountains are old, older than we can really comprehend, and that there are things living in them that do not want to be found, things that were here long before humans arrived and will be here long after we are gone. I transferred to a different district 6 months after this incident. I told my supervisors it was for personal reasons, which was true in a way. I could not keep working that section of forest knowing what I knew, seeing that abandoned campsite every time I closed my eyes. I still think about David Marsh. I wonder what happened during those 3 nights he spent being watched by something at the edge of his firelight. I wonder if he dug that grave for himself, knowing what was coming, or if he dug it for something else, and I wonder where he is now, if he is even still alive. I have learned to accept that there are questions I will never have answers to, mysteries that will never be solved. These mountains keep their secrets. Whatever took David Marsh, whatever was captured in those Polaroid photos standing at the edge of the darkness, it is still out there. Other rangers have reported finding similar abandoned campsites over the years, always with the same pattern. Gear left behind, signs of a hasty departure, and sometimes, if you look carefully, evidence that something was watching from the trees. To David Marsh, wherever you are, I hope you found peace. And to whatever walks these mountains in the darkness, whatever follows hikers and watches from the shadows, I hope our paths never cross. Some things are better left unknown. Some places better left unexplored. The wilderness will always have its mysteries, and maybe that is how it should be. I am a 26-year-old landscape photographer from Richmond, Virginia. My work focuses on capturing the natural beauty of the mid-Atlantic region, and I have spent countless hours hiking through wilderness areas with my camera, waiting for that perfect light, that perfect moment when nature reveals something extraordinary. I'm used to being alone in remote places. In fact, I prefer it. When you are alone, you notice things you would miss in a group. The way light filters through morning mist. The sound of a creek that has carved its path through stone for thousands of years. The absolute silence that comes just before dawn. I have always felt safe in the wilderness, more at home among the trees than I ever do in the city. That feeling of safety ended on a cold November morning in the Dolly Sods wilderness of West Virginia. Dolly Sods is a unique place, a high-altitude plateau covered in heath barrens and stunted spruce trees that look more like something you would find in Canada than in West Virginia. The landscape is otherworldly, with red spruce and cranberry bogs, creating an ecosystem unlike anywhere else in the region. I had been planning this trip for months, waiting for the right conditions. I wanted to capture sunrise over the bogs when the autumn colors would still be present, but the higher elevation would give me a chance at frost and maybe even an early snow. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 30s, perfect for what I had in mind. I arrived at the trailhead late on a Friday afternoon in early November and hiked in about 4 miles to a spot I had scouted on a previous day trip. There is a rocky outcrop that overlooks a series of bogs and provides a panoramic view of the plateau stretching toward the distant ridgelines. I set up my tent near the outcrop, positioning it to be sheltered from the wind that constantly sweeps across the exposed highland. By the time I had camp established and had eaten a simple dinner, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple. I took a few test shots, checking my settings and planning my compositions for the morning. Everything was perfect. As darkness fell, I retreated to my tent and settled in for the night. The plan was to sleep for a few hours, then wake around 4 in the morning to be in position for sunrise. I had done this routine dozens of times before. I set my alarm, crawled into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep listening to the wind rustling through the stunted spruce trees. I woke suddenly around 2 in the morning, though my alarm had not gone off. Something had pulled me out of sleep, some sound or sensation that my subconscious registered as wrong. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the wind and the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then I noticed something that made me uneasy. The air inside my tent felt different, heavier somehow, and when I exhaled, I could see my breath condensing in the beam of my headlamp. The temperature had dropped significantly, which was not unusual for this elevation, but there was something else, a smell. Damp and earthy, like wet stone and rotting vegetation. I unzipped my tent flap slightly and looked outside. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Fog. Thick, dense fog that had rolled in while I was sleeping, reducing visibility to just a few feet. I could barely see the outline of the rocks I had been standing on just hours earlier. The fog was so thick that my headlamp beams simply disappeared into white mist. I had checked the weather forecast carefully before this trip. There had been no mention of fog. At this elevation, fog was not uncommon, but this seemed different, unnaturally dense. I zipped the tent back up and tried to go back to sleep, but I could not shake the feeling of unease. That was when I heard the first sound, metal on stone, a slow rhythmic scraping like someone dragging a chain or a piece of metal across the rocky ground. The sound was distant at first, maybe 100 yards away, but it was distinct. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. The rhythm was too regular to be a natural sound, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and listened. The scraping continued for perhaps a minute, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven footsteps moving through the fog, coming from the direction where I had heard the scraping. But the gait was wrong, irregular, as if whatever was making the sound was dragging something or limping badly. The footsteps moved slowly, and from the sound of it, they were circling my campsite, staying just beyond the range where I could see anything in the fog. I sat there in my tent, barely breathing, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It could be another hiker, I told myself, though that seemed unlikely. Dolly Sods was not heavily trafficked, especially not in November, and especially not in the middle of the night. It could be an animal, though I could not think of any animal that made sounds like that. The footsteps continued, a slow circuit around my tent that took several minutes to complete. Then they stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard breathing, slow, raspy breathing that sounded labored and wet, like someone struggling to draw air through damaged lungs. The sound was close, maybe 10 feet from my tent. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but something deep in my gut told me that was a terrible idea. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to stay silent, to not let whatever was out there know I was awake. Then I heard my name, a voice, low and distorted, speaking from somewhere in the fog. Grace. Just my name, nothing more. The voice was wrong, the inflection off, as if someone who did not quite understand human speech was trying to form the word. I felt ice run down my spine. I had not told anyone my name. I had not spoken to another person since leaving my car at the trailhead the day before. There was no way anyone out here should know my name. The voice spoke again, slightly louder this time. Grace, come outside. The words were slow and deliberate, each syllable pronounced carefully but incorrectly, with stress in all the wrong places. I did not respond. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, my flashlight clutched in one hand, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had was telling me not to answer, not to acknowledge the voice. The breathing continued for another minute. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent back into the fog. I could hear the scraping sound again, that metallic dragging noise, receding into the distance. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Minutes passed. The sounds faded. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever had been outside my tent was still out there in the fog, waiting. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I sat there with my flashlight off, listening to every tiny noise, analyzing every shift in the wind. Around 3 a.m, I heard the footsteps return. This time they were closer, moving directly toward my tent. I could hear the fog itself seeming to part as something large moved through it. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear the breathing again, that awful wet rasping, coming from just on the other side of the thin nylon fabric. Then something touched my tent. I felt pressure against the wall, moving slowly from the bottom upward, as if something was running its hand along the outside of the tent. I could see the fabric pressing inward, could make out the shape of what might have been fingers, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints bending at angles that did not match human anatomy. The pressure increased, and I realized with horror that whatever was touching my tent could tear through the fabric easily if it wanted to. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed, a raw, primal scream of terror and defiance, throwing my full body weight against the opposite wall of the tent. The pressure immediately released. I heard a sound that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely, and then rapid movement. Whatever had been touching my tent pulled back and moved away quickly. The footsteps receded into the fog, faster now, the uneven gait turning into something that almost sounded like running. I sat there shaking, my breath coming in short gasps, listening as the footsteps faded into the distance. I waited for them to come back, certain that whatever it was would return. But the minutes ticked by and there was only silence. The fog remained thick and impenetrable, but the presence was gone. I could feel the difference, as if some oppressive weight had been lifted from the air. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my tent with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the fog, I had never been so grateful to see morning. As the sun rose, the fog began to lift, burning off in patches to reveal the familiar landscape of rock and scrub that had seemed so beautiful just hours before. As soon as there was enough light to see, I emerged from my tent and examined the area. I found my tent stakes on one side had been pulled partially out of the ground, as if something had indeed been pushing against the tent with significant force. On the fabric itself, I found something that made my blood run cold. Handprints, or what looked like handprints. They were pressed into the condensation that had formed on the tent during the night, dozens of them, different sizes, all over the side of my tent. But the prints were not quite right. The fingers were too long, and there seemed to be too many of them. I looked around the immediate area for footprints, for any physical evidence of what had been circling my camp. The ground was rocky with patches of moss and low vegetation, not ideal for preserving tracks, but I did find a few impressions in the softer ground near the creek. They were large, roughly humanoid in shape, but the depth and spacing suggested something much heavier than a person. I photographed them with my camera, making sure to include a lens cap for scale. I packed up my tent as quickly as I have ever packed anything in my life. I did not wait for sunrise photos, did not stop to admire the landscape, did not do any of the things I had hiked in there to do. I just wanted to get out. I hiked the 4 miles back to the trailhead in record time, practically running the last mile when I finally caught sight of the parking area. My car was the only vehicle there. I threw my gear in the back and sat in the driver's seat, shaking, trying to process what had happened. After I calmed down enough to drive, I went to the nearest ranger station and filed a report. The ranger on duty listened to my account carefully and took notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. When I mentioned the voice calling my name, he asked if I had my name written anywhere on my gear. I checked. On the outside pocket of my backpack, which I had left leaning against a rock outside my tent, I'd written my name in permanent marker along with my phone number, a precaution in case I ever lost it. The ranger suggested that perhaps another hiker had seen my name and was playing a prank, but that did not explain the handprints, the breathing, the uneven footsteps, or the fog that appeared without warning. I did my own research later. Dolly Sods has a reputation among locals for being a strange place. The name itself comes from an old German family who grazed cattle there in the 19th century. But before that, before European settlement, the area was considered sacred by the Native Americans who lived in the region. Some sources claim they avoided camping there, believing the plateau was home to spirits that did not welcome human presence. I found online accounts from other hikers who reported similar experiences: unexplained fog, voices calling from the mist, the feeling of being watched or followed. One account described a figure seen moving through the fog, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I still have the photographs I took that morning after the fog lifted. The images of the handprints on my tent are clear enough to see the abnormal finger length and spacing. The footprint impressions near the creek are less distinct, but they show something large and bipedal moved through my camp. I have shown these photos to biologists and trackers. Nobody can identify what made them. I have not been back to Dolly Sods, and I have no plans to return. I still work as a landscape photographer. I still camp alone in remote places, but I'm more careful now about where I go and what stories those places carry. I research the history, the folklore, the whispered warnings that get dismissed as superstition, because that night taught me that some of those warnings are based on truth, to whatever was in that fog, to the thing that called my name and touched my tent with those impossible fingers. I hope you stay in that highland wilderness. I hope you remain content to wander those bogs and rocky outcrops far from civilization. And I hope that anyone who reads this will think twice before camping alone in Dolly Sods, especially when the fog rolls in thick and heavy and the voices start calling from the mist. Jack. I'm a 30-year-old history teacher from Nashville, Tennessee, and I have always been fascinated by local folklore and the stories that shape regional identity. Growing up in the South, you are surrounded by ghost stories and legends that have been passed down through generations. Most of them I never took seriously. They were entertainment, cautionary tales, ways of making sense of tragedies from the past. But there was one legend that always intrigued me more than the others: the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. It is one of the most documented hauntings in American history, with accounts dating back to the early 1800s. The story goes that a malevolent entity tormented the Bell family for years, physically attacking them, speaking in voices, and ultimately causing the death of the family patriarch John Bell. The cave on their property is said to still be haunted by this entity. I had driven past the Bell Witch Cave dozens of times over the years, always meaning to visit, but never quite making the time. This past October, I decided to do more than just visit. I wanted to experience the place the way people would have experienced it in the 1800s, without the safety of a tour group or the comfort of a car parked nearby. I planned a solo camping trip on public land adjacent to the historic Bell property. I knew it was probably a stupid idea, but I convinced myself it was for research purposes. I teach American history, and the Bell Witch case is a fascinating example of how folklore intersects with documented historical events. Multiple credible witnesses, including Andrew Jackson, reported encountering the entity. I wanted to see if there was any truth to the persistent reports of paranormal activity in the area. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October and set up my tent in a small clearing about a quarter mile from the cave entrance. The property where the original Bell homestead stood is now privately owned, but the cave itself is a tourist attraction that closes at dusk. I plan to explore the area during the day and then spend the night camping nearby. The weather was perfect for autumn camping, cool but not cold, with clear skies and a forecast that promised no rain. I set up camp, made dinner over my portable stove, and spent the evening reading historical accounts of the Bell Witch haunting by the light of my camping lantern. According to the legend, the entity first appeared to the Bell family in 1817, manifesting as strange sounds, pulling blankets off beds, and eventually developing the ability to speak. It claimed to be several different spirits at various times, but most often identified itself as Kate Batts, a neighbor woman who had a dispute with John Bell over land. The entity tormented the family for 4 years, with particular focus on John Bell and his daughter Betsy. John Bell died in 1820 under mysterious circumstances, claiming the entity had poisoned him. After his death, the entity claimed responsibility and then largely disappeared, though it promised to return. The cave on the Bell property was said to be a focal point of the paranormal activity, and visitors have reported strange experiences there for nearly 200 years. I went to bed around 11 that night feeling a little foolish for being nervous, but unable to shake a sense of unease. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, with none of the usual night sounds you expect in the woods. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. It was a woman's laugh, high and mocking, echoing through the trees. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several women were laughing at the same time. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart already pounding. The laughter continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I grabbed my flashlight and listened. Silence. I told myself it was probably teenagers playing pranks, trying to scare campers near the famous haunted cave. But the rationalization felt hollow. After a few minutes of silence, I started to relax. Then the rocks started. Small pebbles and stones began hitting my tent from outside, pelting the fabric with sharp, snapping sounds. I yelled out, telling whoever was doing it to stop, that this was not funny. The rocks stopped immediately, but now I could hear whispers, dozens of overlapping voices speaking in a language I did not recognize, or perhaps speaking English, but too softly and too quickly for me to make out individual words. The whispers surrounded my tent, moving in a circle around me. My camping lantern, which I had turned off before going to sleep, suddenly flickered on by itself. The battery was fresh, installed just that afternoon. The light pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, like a heartbeat. Then the temperature inside my tent dropped dramatically. I went from being comfortable in my sleeping bag to being able to see my breath in the span of maybe 10 seconds. I could feel the cold radiating through the fabric of the tent, unnatural and oppressive. Something grabbed my sleeping bag from the bottom and pulled, hard. I was yanked several inches toward the tent entrance before I managed to grab the sides of my sleeping bag and pull back. The tugging continued, a tug of war with something I could not see, something strong enough that I was losing ground. My tent stakes started pulling out of the ground one by one, the tent beginning to collapse as whatever was outside continued pulling. I was shouting now, yelling for it to stop, pulling back with all my strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the pulling stopped. I lay there gasping, my heart hammering, my hands shaking. The tent was partially collapsed around me, the stakes on one side pulled completely out of the ground. The temperature was still freezing. My breath came out in clouds of vapor. Then the whispers started again, but this time they coalesced into words I could understand. Multiple voices speaking in unison, some male, some female, some that sounded impossibly old and raspy. They said, "You should not have come here." I scrambled out of the collapsed tent, fighting with the nylon fabric, finally emerging into the night air. The temperature outside was normal, maybe 50 degrees. A stark contrast to the freezing air inside my tent. I stood there in my long underwear and boots, flashlight in one hand, looking around wildly. The forest was dark, my flashlight beam cutting through the blackness, but revealing nothing unusual. Just trees and shadows. Then I saw her. About 20 feet away, standing between two trees, there was a figure. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, a long dress that might have been from the 1800s. Even in the dim light from my flashlight, I could see that something was wrong with her. Her eyes were completely black, no whites visible, just empty dark holes in her pale face. Her mouth was open, impossibly wide, wider than any human jaw should be able to open. And as I stared in frozen horror, she released a sound that I can only describe as a shriek. It was not a human sound. It was metal grinding on bone, glass breaking, nails on a chalkboard, all the most painful sounds you can imagine compressed into one terrible noise that seemed to pierce straight through my skull. I ran. I did not think about my camping gear, my car keys, my wallet, anything. I just ran through the dark woods toward where I thought the road was. Branches whipped my face. I tripped over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear her footsteps, keeping pace with me, matching my stride. I didn't look back. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. When I finally broke through the tree line onto the gravel road that led to the parking area, I looked back. The figure was standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, watching me. As I stood there gasping for breath, she slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. Then she smiled, and that smile was worse than the scream had been, full of malice and ancient hatred. I ran the half mile to the parking area where my car was locked. I had left my keys in my tent. I was standing there in my long underwear at 2 a.m, no keys, no phone, no way to get home, and no intention of going back into those woods. I started walking toward the main road, figuring I could flag down a car or walk to the nearest house. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, headlights appeared behind me. I turned and saw a pickup truck slowing down. The driver was an older man, probably in his 60s, and he rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I must have looked insane, standing there in my underwear covered in scratches and dirt. I told him I had been camping and had a problem, that I needed help. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You were camping near the cave, were you not?" I nodded. He said, "Get in. You are not the first person to come running out of those woods in the middle of the night." His name was Robert, and he lived in Adams his whole life. As we drove back to the parking area so I could try to retrieve my belongings at first light, he told me stories. He said the entity, whatever it is, never really left. It quieted down for decades at a time, but it was always there. People who camp near the cave, especially around the anniversary of John Bell's death, often report experiences similar to mine. Strange sounds, objects moving, temperature drops, and sightings of a woman in old-fashioned clothing. He said most locals know better than to go near that area after dark. The cave tours are fine during the day with groups of people, but nighttime is when things get dangerous. We waited in his truck until dawn. Robert had a rifle in his truck, and he said he would go with me to retrieve my gear. When we hiked back to my campsite in the morning light, the scene was disturbing. My tent was not just collapsed but shredded, the fabric torn in long strips as if something with claws had ripped through it. My camping gear was scattered in a wide circle around the site. My sleeping bag was in a tree hanging from a branch 15 feet off the ground. There was no way the wind could have put it there. My car keys were lying in the center of where my tent had been, placed neatly on a flat rock. Robert helped me gather what was salvageable, and we hiked back out without speaking much. I did more research when I got home, diving deep into historical records and modern accounts. The Bell Witch is not just folklore. There are sworn testimonies from the 1800s, newspaper accounts, letters, and documents from credible witnesses who experienced the phenomena. Andrew Jackson reportedly encountered the entity during a visit to the Bell farm and left the next morning, declaring he would rather fight the British again than spend another night in that house. The entity has been investigated by paranormal researchers for decades, with many documenting strange occurrences at the cave and the surrounding area. What struck me most was the consistency of the reports. People described the same things: the laughter, the whispers, the physical attacks, the woman in old-fashioned clothing with the black eyes and impossible mouth. I have never gone back to Adams. I drive a different route now when traveling through that area, avoiding the road that passes the Bell Witch Cave. I sold all my camping gear because I could not shake the association with that night. My students sometimes ask me to tell ghost stories, and I tell them plenty, but I never tell them about the Bell Witch. Some stories are better left untold, some experiences better left unshared. To the entity in those woods, to Kate Batts or whatever you truly are, you made your point. I heard you. I felt you. I saw you. And I will never return. The cave is yours. The forest is yours. Adams, Tennessee is yours. I wanted to know if the legend was true, if there was any reality behind the stories. I have my answer now, and it is an answer I wish I did not have. Some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed. Some knowledge changes you in ways you cannot undo. I sleep with the lights on now more often than I care to admit. And sometimes, late at night, I hear laughter in the distance that sounds too familiar, too mocking, too real to be my imagination. I am a 27-year-old nurse working in Knoxville, Tennessee, and my boyfriend Lucas and I share a love of the outdoors that brought us together 3 years ago. We met on a hiking trail, actually, both of us solo hiking and striking up a conversation at a scenic overlook. Since then, we have spent nearly every weekend exploring the wilderness areas of the Southeast. The Great Smoky Mountains have always been our favorite destination. Close enough for weekend trips, but vast enough that we discover something new every time we visit. We consider ourselves experienced hikers. We know how to navigate, how to prepare for emergencies, how to respect the wilderness. We thought we knew these mountains. What happened last July taught us that the Smokies still hold mysteries that defy explanation. We planned a 3-day backpacking trip in early July, choosing a popular loop trail that would take us through some of the most beautiful sections of the park. We filed our itinerary with a friend back in Knoxville, packed appropriately for summer conditions, and set out on a Thursday morning in perfect weather. The first day of hiking was exactly what we hoped for. We covered about 8 miles, saw a black bear from a safe distance, and reached our planned campsite by mid-afternoon. We set up our tent near a creek, cooked dinner, and spent the evening watching the fireflies emerge as darkness fell. Everything was perfect. The next morning, we broke camp early and continued on the trail. Around noon, we reached a creek crossing where the trail split. Lucas wanted to scout ahead to a viewpoint that was marked on our map, maybe a quarter mile up a side trail. I was tired from the morning hike and told him I would wait at the creek, rest for a bit, and maybe filter some water. He said he would be back in 10 minutes, 15 at most. I watched him hike up the trail until he disappeared around a bend. Then I sat down on a flat rock beside the creek and pulled out my water filter. 20 minutes passed. I called his name. No response. I figured maybe he had gotten caught up taking photos, or the viewpoint was farther than the map indicated. 30 minutes. I started to feel uneasy. Lucas was always punctual, always kept to the plan. I hiked up to the viewpoint myself. It was not far, maybe 300 yards. The viewpoint was beautiful, a rocky outcrop with a panoramic view of the valley below, but Lucas was not there. I looked around carefully, thinking maybe he had gone off trail to get a better photo angle. Nothing. No sign of him. I hiked back down to the creek and checked the main trail in both directions. He was not there. I called his cell phone. No signal, which was expected in the backcountry. I started hiking the loop in the direction we were supposed to be going, thinking maybe he had gotten confused and continued without me. I hiked for over a mile, calling his name constantly. Other hikers I encountered had not seen him. I backtracked to the creek crossing and searched the other direction. Nothing. By 3 in the afternoon, I was starting to panic. I hiked the 2 miles back to the nearest trail intersection where I knew there was an emergency phone. I called park rangers and reported Lucas missing. They took the report seriously, asked me detailed questions about what he was wearing, what gear he had, his experience level, his physical condition. They told me to return to the last place I saw him and wait there. A search team would be dispatched immediately. I hiked back to the creek crossing, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Maybe he had fallen and was injured. Maybe he had gotten lost. Maybe he had encountered wildlife. None of the scenarios seemed right. Lucas was too careful, too experienced. The first search team arrived within 2 hours, 3 rangers with a tracking dog. They found Lucas's water bottle on the trail near the viewpoint, but nothing else. No footprints leaving the trail, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing. The dog picked up Lucas's scent at the viewpoint and followed it back to where I had been sitting at the creek, then lost it completely. It was as if Lucas had simply vanished into thin air at that exact spot. The ranger in charge told me that sometimes people wander off trail and become disoriented, but even he seemed puzzled by the complete absence of any trail. More search teams arrived as evening fell. They brought in additional dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and volunteers from local search and rescue organizations. They searched through the night, covering every trail within a 5-mile radius, checking every creek and ravine where someone could have fallen. I stayed at the creek crossing, refusing to leave, hoping Lucas would somehow find his way back. The rangers brought me food and water and tried to convince me to go back to the ranger station, but I could not leave. This was the last place I'd seen him. If he came back, I needed to be here. Day 2 of the search brought helicopters and more volunteers. The search area expanded to cover over 20 square miles. News crews showed up. Lucas's parents drove in from Atlanta. The story made local news. Experienced hiker vanishes on well-marked trail in broad daylight. The Park Service brought in their best trackers. They found nothing. It was as if Lucas had been erased from existence at that creek crossing. On the 4th day, I was sitting at the ranger station, exhausted and numb, when a ranger came in and said they had found someone. My heart leapt. They had found a hiker matching Lucas's description at a trailhead 8 miles away from where he disappeared. He was alive, walking out of the woods on his own, but he was disoriented and dehydrated. I rode with the rangers to meet him. When I saw Lucas, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt and sunburned. His clothes were torn, and his hiking boots were shredded as if he had walked through broken glass. But it was his eyes that scared me most. They were wide and confused, unfocused, as if he was not entirely present. He saw me and seemed to recognize me, but he could not speak coherently. Paramedics checked him over, gave him water, and transported him to the hospital. I rode in the ambulance with him, holding his hand, asking him what happened. He just stared at me with those confused eyes and said nothing. At the hospital, doctors found he was severely dehydrated and malnourished, with numerous cuts and abrasions on his feet and legs. But there was no head trauma, no signs of injury that would explain his condition. He was physically intact, just exhausted. When he was stable enough to talk, the questions began. Park rangers, his parents, the doctors, and me. We all wanted to know the same thing. What happened? Lucas could not tell us. He remembered hiking to the viewpoint. He remembered standing there looking at the valley. Then nothing. The next thing he remembered was standing on a completely different trail, watching the sun set, with no memory of how he got there or how much time had passed. He thought maybe an hour had gone by. 4 days had passed. He had no memory of those 4 days. No memory of walking, eating, sleeping, nothing. It was as if someone had pressed pause on his consciousness and then pressed play again days later and miles away. Medical tests showed no evidence of drugs or toxins in his system. No head injury to explain amnesia. Psychological evaluation found no evidence of a fugue state or dissociative episode. Lucas was healthy. His memory before and after the missing time was intact, but those 4 days were just gone, erased. When he tried to remember, he said it felt like reaching for something in a dark room that was not there. Not forgotten, but removed entirely. The Park Service could not explain it. The search area between where Lucas disappeared and where he reappeared was rough, difficult terrain that would take an experienced hiker a full day to cross. And Lucas had crossed it in boots that were destroyed, suggesting he had walked much farther than 8 miles. But he had no memory of the journey, no explanation for how he survived 4 days without food or water, and no recollection of where he had been. I started researching after we got home, looking for similar cases. What I found disturbed me deeply. The Great Smoky Mountains have an unusually high number of disappearances. People vanish on well-marked trails in broad daylight. Experienced hikers who know what they are doing. Some are never found. Others turn up days later, miles away, with no memory of the intervening time, just like Lucas. The pattern is consistent enough that some researchers have documented it, though there is no official explanation. The Park Service attributes it to people getting lost and disoriented, but that explanation does not account for the missing time, the lack of memory, or the strange locations where people are found. I found online forums where people shared similar stories. A woman who disappeared for 3 days in the Smokies and reappeared with no memory, claiming she blinked, and suddenly hours had passed. A man who vanished on a day hike and was found 5 days later 40 miles from where he started, with shredded clothing and no recollection of walking that distance. A teenage girl who went missing for a week and was found alive but could not explain where she had been, saying only that she remembered seeing lights and hearing voices but could not recall any details. Lucas never fully recovered his memory of those 4 days. Months of therapy and hypnosis revealed nothing. The trauma of the experience, the not knowing, changed him. He has nightmares, where he is walking through endless forests that shift and change around him, where time moves differently and he can never find his way out. He developed a fear of being alone in nature that he never had before. We went on one more hiking trip together after he recovered, a short day hike on a heavily populated trail. He had a panic attack halfway through, and we had to turn back. We are still together. We got married last spring, but we do not hike anymore, do not camp, do not visit the mountains that we both once loved. Lucas does not talk about what happened, and I have learned not to push him. But sometimes I catch him staring into space with that same confused, distant look he had when they found him, and I know he is trying to remember those missing 4 days, trying to grasp something that is no longer there. To whatever took Lucas from that trail and returned him 4 days later, to whatever exists in the Great Smoky Mountains that can make time disappear and memories vanish, I have only one thing to say. Thank you for giving him back. I do not know what you are or what you wanted with him. I do not know if you are something supernatural, something beyond our understanding of reality, or simply a phenomenon science has not yet explained. But you gave him back to me, and for that I am grateful. I will never understand what happened on that trail, and maybe I am not meant to. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Lucas is alive, and that is enough. To the Smoky Mountains, and whatever secrets they hold, you can keep them. We will find our peace elsewhere, in places where time moves normally and memories stay intact. I am a 33-year-old software engineer from Richmond, Virginia, and I spend most of my time behind a computer screen writing code and debugging systems. It is precise work that requires logic and reason, everything following clear rules and predictable outcomes. Maybe that is why I have always been drawn to the wilderness. Nature is the opposite of what I do for a living. It is chaotic, unpredictable, and follows rules that humans do not fully understand. I started backpacking 5 years ago as a way to disconnect from technology and reconnect with something more primal. I loved the challenge of navigating by map and compass, the satisfaction of setting up camp in a remote location, the peace that comes from being completely alone in the forest. Last September, I planned a solo backpacking trip in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I had hiked there before on day trips, but never spent the night in the backcountry. I chose a remote area far from established campgrounds, planning to practice dispersed camping and wilderness navigation skills. The forecast called for clear weather, and I packed for 2 nights in the woods. I entered the forest on a Saturday morning, following an old logging road that would take me several miles into the backcountry before I would leave the trail and find my own campsite. Around 4 in the afternoon, as the sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon, I found what looked like a perfect spot. A small clearing surrounded by thick forest, with a creek nearby for water. As I was about to drop my pack and start setting up camp, I noticed something through the trees. A structure. Curious, I walked toward it and found myself standing in front of an old cabin. It was small, maybe 12 by 12 feet, constructed of weathered gray logs that looked like they had been standing for decades. The roof was partially collapsed, and the windows were boarded shut with old planks. But what struck me most was the doorway. The cabin had no door, just an empty frame leading into darkness. I peered inside carefully, not wanting to disturb any wildlife that might have taken shelter there. The interior was mostly empty, stripped bare by time and weather. There was an old iron bed frame in one corner, rusted and falling apart. A rough wooden table sat in the center of the room, with a single chair, both covered in dust and debris. On the table was a journal. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside to look at it. The cabin smelled of rot and dampness, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. The journal was old, bound in cracked leather with yellowed pages. I opened it carefully. The entries were written in shaky handwriting, dated from 1973. The first few pages described a man who had come to the cabin to get away from the noise of civilization, to find peace in the wilderness. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The entries became increasingly disturbed. The man wrote about hearing voices in the woods at night, about seeing shapes moving between the trees. He described how they watched him from the darkness, how he could feel their eyes on him even when he could not see them. He wrote about trying to leave but always finding himself back at the cabin, as if the forest itself was turning him around. The final entry, dated November 3rd, 1973, read, "If you are reading this, you are already too late. They will not let you leave either. The forest has claimed me, and now it will claim you. Do not try to run. Do not try to hide. They are always watching, and they are patient." I laughed it off as a creepy story, probably written by someone trying to scare future hikers. It was well done, I had to admit, but obviously fiction. I closed the journal and put it back on the table. I decided not to stay in the cabin itself, but to set up my tent about 100 yards away in the clearing I had initially spotted. I did not believe in ghosts or curses, but there was something unsettling about the place that made me want to keep my distance. I set up camp efficiently, filtered water from the creek, and made dinner as the sun set. As darkness fell, I found myself glancing toward the cabin more often than I wanted to admit. Even from 100 yards away, that empty doorway seemed to pull at my attention, a rectangle of deeper darkness against the dark forest. I went to bed around 10, tired from the day's hike. I fell asleep easily, the sounds of the forest providing a familiar backdrop. I do not know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still fully dark. I was standing, not lying in my sleeping bag in my tent, but standing upright. And I was not in my tent. I was inside the cabin, standing in front of the table. The journal was open in front of me. My headlamp was on, illuminating the page, and there, in my own handwriting, was a new entry dated that day. "I tried to leave, but I'm still here. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking to the cabin, no memory of writing those words. But they were there, in my handwriting, in blue ink, from the pen I kept in my jacket pocket. My heart started pounding. I looked around the cabin. The empty doorway was behind me, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something outside, a shape darker than the darkness, watching. I did not wait to see if it was real. I ran. I crashed through the doorway, sprinting back toward my tent, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged, and underneath it, I swear I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. I did not look back. I reached my tent, grabbed my backpack without bothering to put anything away properly, and started hiking. I did not care that it was the middle of the night. I did not care about the danger of night hiking. I just needed to get away from that cabin, away from that forest. I hiked by headlamp for hours, following the old logging road back the way I had come. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, the sound of someone or something moving through the forest parallel to the road. I kept my headlamp pointed forward and kept walking. When I glanced at my GPS around 3 a.m, I realized I had covered almost 7 miles, far more than I should have been able to hike in the dark on rough terrain. Adrenaline is a powerful thing. I reached my car just as the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. I threw my gear in the trunk and sat in the driver's seat, shaking. It took me 20 minutes before I could get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, arriving just as they were opening for the day. I told the ranger on duty what happened, showed him the journal I had grabbed from the cabin. He looked at it, flipped through the pages, and his expression grew serious when he saw the entry in my handwriting. He asked me if I could show him on a map where the cabin was located. I tried. I spent an hour with topographic maps trying to pinpoint the location. I knew roughly where I had entered the forest, knew which logging road I had followed, but I could not identify the exact location of the clearing and the cabin. The ranger made some calls. Over the next few days, I learned that there was no record of any structure in that area. The National Forest maintains records of all historical buildings, old homesteads, and structures within its boundaries for preservation purposes. According to their database, there was nothing where I said I had found the cabin. I tried to find it again on satellite imagery. I spent hours on Google Earth, zooming in on every clearing in that section of forest. Nothing. I even considered going back to try to find it on foot, but I could not bring myself to do it. The thought of returning to those woods made my hands shake and my stomach turn. I kept the journal. I know I should have left it there or turned it over to authorities, but I needed proof that I had not imagined the whole thing. The entry in my handwriting was still there, dated September 23rd. I have shown it to friends, to co-workers, even to a psychologist. Nobody can explain it. Sleepwalking does not account for the level of detail or the fact that I navigated to the cabin in the dark and wrote a coherent sentence. There were no drugs in my system, no alcohol, no medication that could cause that kind of dissociative state. I did some research into the history of the Monongahela National Forest. The area was logged heavily in the early 1900s, and there were numerous temporary camps and structures built by logging companies. Many of these were abandoned when the timber was exhausted, and the land was eventually incorporated into the National Forest System. It is possible the cabin was one of these old logging structures, too remote or too damaged to be included in official records. But that does not explain the journal entries from 1973, or why I have no memory of writing in it, or why I cannot find the cabin again. The more I think about it, the more I question what was real. Did I really find that cabin, or did I dream the whole thing? But I have the journal. It is sitting on my desk right now, a physical object with weight and substance. The pages are real. The entry in my handwriting is real. I have checked the ink against other things I have written. It matches. It is my pen, my handwriting, my words, but I have no memory of writing them. I sold all my camping gear 2 months after this happened. I could not look at my tent without seeing that empty cabin doorway, without feeling the disorientation of waking up somewhere I should not be. I've not been hiking since. I tried once, a simple day hike on a popular trail near my home. I made it maybe half a mile before the anxiety became overwhelming and I had to turn back. The forest does not feel the same anymore. It feels like it is watching, waiting, patient. Some nights I wake up with the fear that I am standing somewhere I should not be, that I have walked in my sleep to some place I cannot escape. I check my apartment, make sure all the doors are locked, make sure I am where I am supposed to be. I started sleeping with the lights on, which seems ridiculous for a grown man, but the darkness reminds me too much of that cabin, of waking up with no memory of how I got there. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe there is a medical explanation, some neurological condition that caused a temporary fugue state. Maybe the stress of being alone in the woods triggered something in my brain, but medical tests showed nothing abnormal. I'm healthy. My brain is fine. There is no physiological reason for what happened. The journal entry haunts me more than anything else. I tried to leave, but I'm still here. What does that mean? Did some part of me actually try to leave the forest that night and fail? Am I still there, in some way, wandering in those woods? Or did I tap into something else when I entered that cabin? Some echo of the man who wrote the original entries? Some residual consciousness that used my hand to write a message I did not intend? I do not have answers. I have only questions and a journal I cannot explain, and memories that do not connect properly. I know I went into the forest. I know I found a cabin. I know I woke up inside it with no memory of walking there. And I know I will never go back to find out what else I might discover. To the cabin with no door, wherever you are in that forest, I hope I never find you again. To whatever made me walk to you in the dark and put words on a page that I do not remember writing, I hope you stay in those woods. Some places are not meant to be found. Some experiences are not meant to be understood. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets keep a piece of you as, well. I am a 24-year-old graduate student studying environmental science at the University of Tennessee. My research focuses on highland ecosystems, which means I spend a lot of time in the field collecting data, taking measurements, and documenting plant and animal populations. I love my work because it gives me an excuse to be in the wilderness, to explore places most people never see. I've always felt comfortable in nature, more at home under the stars than in any building. That feeling of safety was shattered last August, during what should have been a routine camping trip in the Cherokee National Forest. My two best friends from my undergraduate program, Sarah and Emma, joined me for a weekend of camping and kayaking on one of the remote lakes in the forest. We had been planning the trip for months, coordinating our schedules to find a weekend when all three of us were free. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in perfect summer weather, warm but not hot, with clear skies that promised excellent stargazing. We set up our tents near the lake shore in a designated camping area that was far enough from the main park facilities to feel secluded but still technically within the boundaries of established campsites. We spent the day kayaking, swimming, and relaxing by the water. It was exactly what we needed after a stressful summer of research and coursework. As evening fell, we built a fire and cooked dinner, talking and laughing as the sun set behind the ridgeline. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah pointed toward the sky. Above the tree line to the north, there were lights. At first, I thought they were aircraft, but the movement was all wrong. The lights were glowing orbs, maybe a dozen of them, moving in sharp angular patterns that no aircraft could replicate. They would hover in place, then suddenly shoot sideways or straight up, then stop again. We watched them for maybe 20 minutes, fascinated and a little unnerved. I pulled out my phone to record video, and both Sarah and Emma did the same. We kept asking each other what we were seeing, throwing out theories. Drones, military aircraft, satellites, atmospheric phenomena. Nothing fit what we were watching. The lights moved too fast, stopped too abruptly, and seemed to respond to each other in coordinated patterns. Then one of the lights descended rapidly and stopped, hovering maybe 100 feet above the lake surface. It pulsed with a blue-white light that was bright enough to illuminate our entire campsite. My phone died, just shut off completely, even though it had been at 70% battery a moment before. Sarah and Emma both said their phones died at the same time. The three of us looked at each other in the strange pulsing light, and I saw my own fear reflected in their faces. The light remained for maybe 5 minutes, pulsing in a steady rhythm. Then it shot straight up and disappeared. The other lights in the sky scattered in different directions and were gone within seconds. We sat there in the darkness, our fire providing the only light. None of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Emma said what we were all thinking. That was not normal. We tried to turn our phones back on. All three were completely dead, would not respond to any buttons, would not charge when we plugged them into our portable battery packs. We decided to stick together and stay by the fire for the rest of the night, figuring we would hike out in the morning and report what we saw. Around midnight, we heard it. A humming sound, low and vibrating, coming from the direction of the lake. It was not a natural sound. It resonated in my chest, making my teeth hurt and my ears ring. The trees started rustling even though there was no wind. The surface of the lake, which had been calm and still, suddenly rippled as if something large was moving beneath it. Then we saw lights again, but this time they were on the ground, in the forest, moving between the trees. There were 3 of them, glowing orbs about the size of basketballs, floating at eye level, weaving between the trees and coming toward our camp. The humming intensified as they approached. Sarah started to stand up and Emma grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. We all had the same instinct. Stay still. Stay quiet. Do not draw attention. The lights reached the edge of our clearing and stopped, hovering about 30 feet away. Up close, I could see they were not solid. They seemed to be made of light itself, pulsing and shifting, with colors that hurt to look at directly. They stayed there for several minutes, and the humming grew louder and more painful. My head started pounding. Emma said later that her nose started bleeding. Sarah said she felt nauseous and dizzy. I felt all of that plus an overwhelming sense of dread, as if every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. But we did not move. We sat there frozen, watching these impossible lights hover at the edge of our campsite. Then the lights pulsed brightly, all 3 at once, and I felt a wave of heat and pressure wash over me. Everything went white. I remember feeling like I was falling, even though I was sitting on the ground. Then nothing. When I came to, I was lying on my back looking at the sky. Sarah and Emma were next to me, both unconscious. Our fire had gone out. I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. It was after 3 in the morning. The last thing I remembered was the lights pulsing, and that had been around midnight. 3 hours were just gone. I shook Sarah and Emma awake. Both of them were disoriented and confused, asking what happened. None of us could remember anything after the lights pulsed. We checked ourselves over for injuries. We all seemed physically fine, but there was something that made my blood run cold. On each of our left shoulders, we had identical circular marks. They looked like burns, about 2 inches in diameter, red and painful to the touch. We had not had these marks before. I knew because we had all been wearing tank tops, and I would have noticed. We did not wait for morning. We packed up our gear as fast as we could, using a flashlight since our phones were still dead. We hiked the 2 miles back to the parking area in the dark, practically running the last half mile. When we got to Sarah's car, we threw our gear in the back and drove straight to the nearest ranger station. It was closed at that hour, but there was an emergency number posted on the door. We called it and waited in the parking lot for a ranger to arrive. The ranger who responded was professional and took our report seriously. He examined the marks on our shoulders and took photographs. He said he would file a report about the lights, which he described as unidentified aerial phenomena, a term I later learned is what authorities use instead of calling something a UFO. He also said that the Cherokee National Forest has had numerous reports of strange lights over the years, going back decades. Some of the reports mentioned people experiencing missing time or physical symptoms after encounters with the lights. He said investigators from various government agencies had looked into it over the years, but there had never been any official explanation. We went to the emergency room in the nearest town. The doctors examined us and documented the burn marks on our shoulders. They could not explain them. The burns were consistent with radiation exposure or extreme heat, but there was no corresponding damage to our clothing. Our tank tops were not singed or marked in any way. The burns were on our skin, but nothing else. Medical tests showed we were in good health otherwise, just dehydrated and exhausted. When we tried to review the videos we had recorded on our phones, we discovered they were corrupted. All 3 phones had captured the initial lights in the sky, but the footage was distorted, showing only static and strange geometric patterns. The audio on all 3 videos consisted of a high-pitched tone that hurt to listen to. None of us could remember our phones behaving strangely while we were recording, but the evidence suggested something had interfered with them. I did extensive research after that night. The Cherokee National Forest is one of several locations in Appalachia with a long history of unexplained light phenomena. Native American accounts describe spirits or beings associated with lights in the mountains dating back centuries. Modern reports include everything from glowing orbs to structured craft to encounters with beings that seem to appear and disappear at will. The missing time experiences are particularly well documented. Dozens of people have reported losing hours or even days after encountering lights in the mountains, with no memory of what happened during that time. The burn marks on our shoulders never fully healed. They faded to scars, but they are still visible, perfect circles on our left shoulders. We each got matching tattoos over them, converting them into something we chose rather than something that was done to us. But I can still feel the scar tissue beneath the ink, a permanent reminder of that night. Sarah quit graduate school and moved back to her hometown in California. She said she could not continue studying environmental science when the environment itself had become something she did not trust or understand. Emma finished her degree but moved to a city job and swore off camping entirely. I continued my research, but I changed my focus. I no longer do fieldwork alone, and I never camp anywhere with a history of light phenomena or unexplained occurrences. The 3 hours we lost still haunt me. I have tried hypnosis, therapy, meditation, anything that might help me remember what happened during that missing time. Nothing has worked. The memories are not buried or suppressed. They are simply not there, as if they were erased or never formed in the first place. Sleep studies showed that I have nightmares I do not remember when I wake up, dreams where I am floating and seeing strange symbols and hearing voices in languages I do not understand. But I wake with no conscious memory of these dreams, only a lingering sense of anxiety and the feeling that I am forgetting something important. I still love the mountains. I still believe in the importance of protecting wilderness and studying ecosystems. But I have learned that nature includes things we do not understand, phenomena that exist outside the boundaries of conventional science. The lights above the Cherokee National Forest are real. Whatever they are, wherever they come from, they have been seen by too many credible witnesses over too long a period to dismiss. And whatever happened during those missing 3 hours, whatever was done to us that left those marks on our shoulders, it was real too. To the lights that hover above the Cherokee National Forest, to whatever intelligence or force controls them, I have only questions. What did you do to us during those 3 hours we cannot remember? Why did you mark us? Are you watching us still? I do not expect answers. Some mysteries are beyond human understanding, And maybe that is how it should be. But I will carry the mark you left on my shoulder for the rest of my life, a permanent reminder that we are not alone in these mountains, and that the universe holds secrets far stranger than anything I learned in my scientific training. Whatever you are, please do not follow us. We were just 3 students trying to enjoy a camping trip. We did not come looking for you. Let the 3 hours you took be enough. Let us move forward with our lives. And to anyone else who sees the lights, my advice is simple. Leave. Do not wait to see what happens next. Some experiences change you in ways you cannot undo. I am a 29-year-old travel blogger who specializes in documenting forgotten places across America. Old abandoned towns, crumbling factories, historic sites that time has left behind. My work takes me to some pretty remote locations, and I have photographed everything from ghost towns in the Southwest to derelict amusement parks in the Rust Belt. I have always been drawn to places with history, especially dark history. There is something compelling about standing in a place where terrible things happened and trying to understand the weight of that tragedy. That fascination brought me to a small town in rural Kentucky last October, to an abandoned church and cemetery that had a story I could not ignore. The church burned down in 1952 under circumstances that were never fully explained. All that remains now is the stone foundation and the cemetery behind it, which is still there, overgrown and neglected but intact. I had read about the place in an old newspaper archive while researching Appalachian history. The article described a tragedy that shocked the region. On a Sunday morning in March of 1952, 11 children died during a communion service at the church. The pastor, a man named Elias Thorne, had poisoned them. According to witness statements, Reverend Thorne had become increasingly unstable in the months leading up to the incident, preaching about the end of the world and claiming that he needed to save the children of his congregation before the devil could claim them. He laced the communion wine with poison. When the parents realized what was happening and tried to stop him, Thorne locked himself in the church. The community burned the building with him still inside. The children were buried in the cemetery behind the church. Reverend Thorne was also buried there, though local tradition says his grave was placed outside the consecrated ground as punishment for his sins. I wanted to document the site, to photograph the gravestones and tell the story of what happened there. I arrived on a gray October afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds sit heavy and low, making everything feel oppressive and dim. The cemetery was easy to find. The church foundation was visible from the road, and a dirt track led back to the graveyard. I parked my car and walked in, my camera hanging around my neck. The cemetery was smaller than I expected, maybe 30 or 40 graves total, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that had fallen down in several places. Weeds grew thick between the headstones, and many of the markers were tilted or broken, but the children's graves were easy to identify. They were all clustered together, small headstones in neat rows, each one carved with a name and the same death date, March 17th, 1952. I spent an hour photographing the gravestones, taking detail shots of the names and dates, wide shots of the entire cemetery. At the center of the graveyard was a large monument, much bigger than the surrounding graves. It was for Reverend Elias Thorne, with an inscription that read, "Shepherd of his flock, 1899-1952. I found it disturbing that his monument was so prominent, given what he had done. I took several photos of it from different angles, noting how it seemed to dominate the cemetery, casting a long shadow even on that cloudy day. As the sun began to set, I decided to leave. I'd gotten the photos I needed, and the atmosphere of the place was starting to get to me. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling of sadness and anger that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. I was walking back to my car when I heard it. Singing, children's voices singing a hymn. The sound was faint and distant, coming from the direction of the cemetery. I stopped and listened, trying to figure out if there was a logical explanation. Maybe there was a church service nearby, sound carrying across the valley. But I was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest building was miles away. I walked back to the cemetery entrance and stood there listening. The singing continued, a slow, mournful hymn that I did not recognize. The voices sounded hollow, as if they were coming from very far away or from underwater. My rational mind told me to leave, to get in my car and drive away. But my curiosity, the same drive that makes me a good documentarian, pushed me forward. I walked back into the cemetery, following the sound. As I moved between the gravestones, I saw them. Shadows. Small figures moving in a circle around Reverend Thorne's monument. They were not solid, just dark shapes against the gray evening light, but they had the size and proportions of children. They were holding hands, moving in a slow circular procession around the grave, and they were singing. I could not make out their faces, could not see any details. They were just shadows, but they moved with purpose and coordination. I raised my camera and took a photo. The flash went off, bright in the dim light. The singing stopped immediately. The shadow children stopped moving and turned to face me. Even though I could not see their faces, I could feel them looking at me. The air got colder, and I could see my breath suddenly. The heaviness I had felt earlier intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then a voice spoke. It was deep and commanding, coming from the direction of Reverend Thorne's monument. "Have you come to join the flock?" The words were clear and distinct, echoing across the cemetery. I knew with absolute certainty that I should not answer, should not engage with whatever was speaking. I turned and ran. Behind me, the singing resumed, but it was different now. Louder, faster, more frantic. It sounded desperate, almost angry. I sprinted toward my car, not looking back, my camera bouncing against my chest. The ground beneath Reverend Thorne's monument was moving. I could see it out of the corner of my eye as I ran. The earth was cracking and sinking, as if something beneath was shifting. I reached my car, fumbled with my keys, and got the door open. As I started the engine, I looked back at the cemetery. The shadow children were standing at the edge of the graveyard, a line of dark figures watching me. They were motionless, just standing there. And in the center, near the monument, there was another figure, taller, broader, dressed in what might have been robes. It raised one arm slowly, pointing at me. I drove away faster than I should have on that narrow dirt road, not slowing down until I reached the main highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I drove to the nearest town and stopped at a gas station, needing to be around other people, needing light and normalcy. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I had not seen what I thought I saw. When I was steady enough, I reviewed the photos on my camera. Most of them were fine, clear shots of the gravestones and the cemetery, but the photos I took at the end, the ones I shot while I heard the singing, were different. In several of them, you could see the shadow children. They were not just shadows caused by light and angles. They were distinct figures, translucent but visible, small shapes holding hands around the monument. And in the last photo, the one I took just before I ran, there was another figure visible, a man standing behind the monument, his face obscured by darkness, his arm raised as if in blessing or condemnation. I researched the Reverend Thorne murders extensively after that night. The newspaper accounts confirmed everything I had read before. 11 children dead, their parents watching in horror, unable to save them. The community's rage leading them to burn the church with Thorne still inside. What I also found were other accounts, mentions in local history books and folklore collections, that said the cemetery was haunted. People reported hearing children singing, seeing small shadows moving between the graves, feeling watched and followed when they visited at dusk. Some claimed to have seen a figure near Thorne's monument, a tall man in dark robes who would appear and disappear without warning. The most disturbing account I found was from a paranormal investigation team that visited the cemetery in the 1990s. They reported experiencing extreme cold hearing voices, and capturing audio recordings of children crying and a man's voice speaking in what sounded like Latin. One team member claimed to have been touched by something invisible and developed scratch marks on his arms. They left after less than an hour, calling the site one of the most oppressive locations they had ever investigated. I never published the blog post I had planned. I could not bring myself to write about what happened, to share those photos, to tell people about that place. I deleted most of the images from my camera, though I kept a few on a backup drive as proof that I had not imagined it. I've looked at them only once since that night. The shadow children are still there in the photos, frozen in their eternal procession around the grave of the man who killed them. I closed my travel blog 6 months later. I could not continue documenting dark places after experiencing true darkness. I got a normal job, working in marketing for a tech company, spending my days in an office instead of exploring abandoned buildings and forgotten cemeteries. My friends ask why I gave up the blog, which was gaining a good following and generating decent income. I tell them I wanted more stability, wanted a regular schedule. The truth is that I cannot go back to those places. I cannot stand in locations where terrible things happened and treat them as just content, just stories to tell. Because now I know that some stories do not end when the newspapers stop reporting them. Some tragedies continue, playing out over and over, trapped in the places where they occurred. To the children in that cemetery, I am sorry for what happened to you. I am sorry that a man who was supposed to protect you took your lives in the name of a twisted faith. I am sorry that you are still there, bound to that place, unable to move on. And to Reverend Elias Thorne, wherever your soul has gone, I hope you face the judgment you deserve. Your monument may still stand in that cemetery, but it is a reminder of evil, not salvation. The children you claim to save are still there, and so are you, locked together in that place by the weight of your crime. I will never go back to that cemetery. I will never speak the names of those children aloud. Will never repeat the exact location of that place. Some stories should remain untold. Some places should remain forgotten. The darkness that lives in that cemetery, the shadows that move at dusk, the voice that calls from beyond the grave, they belong to the past. Let them stay there. And if you ever find yourself near an abandoned church in rural Kentucky, near a cemetery with 11 small graves, all bearing the same date, turn around and leave. Do not take photos. Do not linger at sunset. Do not answer if you hear a voice asking if you have come to join the flock. Some invitations should never be accepted. I'm a 32-year-old wildlife biologist specializing in mammal populations in the southern Appalachian region. My job requires me to spend extensive time in the field, often camping alone in remote areas while conducting surveys and setting up trail cameras. I have been doing this work for 8 years, and I have spent hundreds of nights alone in the wilderness. I have encountered black bears, bobcats, and even a mountain lion once. I know the sounds of the forest intimately, can identify animal calls by ear, and can tell the difference between natural forest noises and something unusual. That knowledge made what happened to me in the Jefferson National Forest last November all the more terrifying, because what I experienced was something I could not explain or categorize. I was conducting a population study in a remote section of the forest in Virginia, an area that sees very little human traffic even during peak hiking season. In November, I was completely alone, the nearest trail miles away. I had set up camp in a designated backcountry site that I had used before without incident. It was a clearing surrounded by oak and hickory trees, with a small stream nearby providing water. I had been there for 3 nights already, checking trail cameras and documenting wildlife activity. Everything had been routine and uneventful. On the 4th night, I woke at exactly 3 in the morning. I know the time because I instinctively checked my watch, a habit from years of recording observation times. I woke suddenly and completely, going from deep sleep to full alertness in an instant, the way you do when your body senses danger. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no night birds, no wind. Just absolute silence, which is never a good sign. In my experience, when the forest goes silent, it means a predator is near. Then I heard it. 3 loud knocks on a tree, deliberate and evenly spaced. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from maybe 50 feet from my tent, off to the east. I waited, listening. Nothing. Then, about 30 seconds later, 3 more knocks, this time from the west, closer. Something was moving around my campsite, knocking on trees in a pattern. I have heard woodpeckers. I have heard branches falling. I have heard bears scratching at trees. This was none of those things. This was deliberate, rhythmic, intentional. The knocking continued, circling my campsite slowly. Each set of 3 knocks came from a different location, and each time they were closer to my tent. I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing through possibilities. Could it be another person? But what person would be wandering through the forest at 3 a.m. knocking on trees? Could it be an animal? But no animal I knew of made that kind of sound or moved in that pattern. The knocking stopped when it had made a complete circle around my tent, having moved to perhaps 20 feet away at its closest point. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps. They were moving slowly and deliberately through the leaves and underbrush, approaching my tent. The steps were heavy, suggesting something large, and they were bipedal, 2-footed, with a human-like rhythm. They stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing now, slow and steady, right outside the nylon wall. My hand moved slowly toward the knife I keep in my tent for emergencies. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to fight if something tried to get in. Then a voice spoke. It was female, soft and almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl. "Are you alone?" The question was clear and deliberate. I did not answer. Every instinct told me not to respond, not to let whatever was outside know I was awake. The breathing continued for a few more seconds. Then the voice spoke again, more insistent this time. "Are you alone out here?" I forced myself to remain silent and still, though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard. The presence stayed outside my tent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then I heard the footsteps retreat, moving away from my tent back into the forest. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any sign that it was coming back. The silence stretched on. Around 5 a.m, when the first gray light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees, I heard the knocking resume. But this time it was different. Instead of circling, the knocks were coming from multiple directions simultaneously, as if several people or things were surrounding my campsite. The pattern was always the same: 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It continued for perhaps 5 minutes, the sound coming from all around me. Then it stopped abruptly. My tent suddenly shook violently, as if something had grabbed it and pulled. I could see the fabric bulging inward from the pressure. I yelled, a loud, aggressive shout, trying to scare away whatever was attacking. The shaking stopped immediately. Then I heard laughter. Multiple voices, both male and female, laughing from different directions around my tent. The laughter was wrong, too high-pitched, too prolonged, with a mocking quality that made my blood run cold. Then one voice, male this time, spoke clearly from just outside my tent. "We know you're alone." The words were simple, but carried an unmistakable threat. I grabbed my radio, which I carry for emergencies, and called out a distress signal, identifying my location and requesting immediate assistance. I do not know if anyone heard me. I was probably out of range of any repeater towers, but I needed to do something. Needed to feel like I was taking action rather than just lying there, helpless. The voices stopped. The forest went silent again. I stayed in my tent, knife in hand, radio clutched to my chest, waiting for full daylight. When the sun finally rose enough that I could see clearly, I emerged from my tent slowly, looking in all directions. The campsite appeared normal. My gear was undisturbed, but when I looked at my tent, I felt my stomach drop. The fabric was covered in handprints, dozens of them pressed into the condensation that had formed on the outside of the tent overnight. The prints were various sizes, some as small as a child's hand, others much larger. They covered the entire side of the tent that faced the forest. I took photographs, documenting everything. Then I broke camp as quickly as I have ever done anything. I packed up my gear, retrieved my trail cameras, and hiked out. The 5-mile hike back to my truck took me less than 2 hours. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way, convinced I was being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. At the ranger station, I filed a report. The ranger I spoke with, an older man who had worked in the Jefferson National Forest for decades, listened carefully. When I described the knocking pattern, he nodded slowly. He told me that area of the forest had reports going back years. Campers described being woken at 3 a.m. by knocking sounds, hearing voices asking if they were alone, experiencing the feeling of being watched or followed. Some reported handprints on their tents. Others described their camps being circled by something unseen. The pattern was consistent across multiple years and dozens of reports. He said the official explanation was that people were experiencing anxiety-induced hallucinations or misinterpreting natural sounds. But unofficially, he told me he believed something was in those woods that should not be there, something that was intelligent enough to use intimidation tactics to test whether campers were alone and vulnerable. He advised me not to camp alone in that section of the forest anymore. I never went back. I transferred to a different research area, one with more human traffic and established camping facilities. I told my supervisors it was because I wanted to work on a different species, which was partly true. But the real reason was that I could no longer trust the wilderness the way I once did. I had spent 8 years believing I understood the forest, that I knew what lived there and how to stay safe. One night shattered that confidence completely. The handprints on my tent haunt me most. I have the photographs stored on my computer, and sometimes late at night I look at them, trying to find a rational explanation. Condensation and random marks from branches or leaves perhaps. But the prints are too clear, too deliberate. They are hands pressing against my tent while I slept inside, testing the barrier between me and whatever was outside. I still work in wildlife biology, but I no longer do solo fieldwork. I insist on having a partner. Even for routine surveys, my colleagues think I am being overly cautious, but they do not know what I know. They have not heard the knocking at 3 in the morning, have not heard voices asking if you are alone, have not woken to find evidence that something was standing outside your tent all night, close enough to touch the fabric, patient enough to wait and watch, to whatever walks the Jefferson National Forest at night, to whatever knocks on trees at 3 in the morning and asks campers if they are alone. I hope you stay in those remote sections of forest. I hope you do not expand your territory. Do not follow the trails to more populated areas. And I hope that anyone who hears those 3 knocks, who hears that soft voice asking if they are alone, has the sense to break camp and leave immediately. Do not wait for morning. Do not try to investigate. Do not assume you are safe because you are an experienced outdoors person. Experience means nothing when you encounter something that operates outside the rules you thought you knew. The wilderness is vast and ancient, and there are things in it that we do not understand, things that watch and wait and test our vulnerabilities in the darkness. I learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible, and I will never forget it.